Alright, so today I want to discuss regurgitation in ball pythons, when the ball python throws up the rodent shortly after it's been eaten before it fully digests the rodent. And there's quite a few ways you can actually prevent regurgitation, but sometimes it just kind of randomly happens. I'd say I probably have maybe about a dozen regurgitations in the last 5 years with like 100 plus snakes over 5 years. So it happens once in a while, but I'd say it's not really a regular occurrence as far as what you would normally expect. And usually when you first start out in snakes, you kind of make some mistakes along the way, and you kind of quickly find out why, you kind of look into it and you figure out, why your snakes are regurgitating and some of the things that you can do to avoid it. And probably the biggest thing, the number one thing when it comes to regurgitation, and that is handling a snake too soon after it's eaten the rodent. And when I first started in snakes in general, the very first reptile store I went into, it was kind of interesting. They actually were taking all the snakes, the corn snakes and everything out of all the enclosures, and they were putting them in feeding tubs, and they were feeding them in the feeding tubs and then moving them back to the main enclosure. I think that's kind of the old school thinking, and a lot of people think, you want to feed them in a feeding tub to reduce the possibility of cage aggression. As far as if you were to actually stick your hands in the cage, you don't want them to think that your hands are a rat, so you kind of want to avoid the bite. But the problem is, I'd say probably to a certain degree you do reduce the cage aggression, but the problem is if you actually take them out of the main enclosure, moving to a feeding tub, the problem is as soon as they eat that rodent, you're picking them up like minutes after they've eaten and putting them back in. And let me tell you, if you have a snake that's not very tame and you try to pick up that snake right after it's eaten a rodent and you kind of move it around a lot and it's kind of squirming around right after it's eaten a rodent, a lot of times that can trigger the snake to regurgitate that rodent. And kind of the interesting thing too is as far as, kind of handling your snake right after you're feeding it. If you actually take a look at the snake around my neck, this is Bobby, my bamboo ball python. And a lot of people have asked, hey, do you ever feed Bobby? He's around your neck every single day in the videos. And essentially what I do with Bobby, I feed him the day before. So essentially right after a video, what I do is I feed him a rodent. And usually when I feed him a smaller rodent that's probably about, let's say maybe 50% of the thickest part of his body. So if you actually look at, he's kind of choking me out here. I don't know what Bobby's doing today. He's getting a little squirrely. Usually I have him the other way. I think he's like, hey, what's going on? My head's usually facing the other way. Look at how big Bobby is. He is a really big, beautiful bamboo. And usually what I do is, for ball pythons, you can usually feed them a rodent that is about as thick as the thickest part of the snake, like right here. Bobby's nice and chunky. Right? He's a pretty thick male. He's a bamboo, 7 years old. And what I do with Bobby is I actually feed him a rodent that's about half as big as the thickest part of his body, because then you can have a little bit more leeway as far as handling. So what I do is I feed him pretty much right after a video, and then for the next video, he's actually been sitting there digesting for about 24 hours, which I think 24 hours is pretty much below the minimum, right at the minimum. I'd probably wait at least 2 days or maybe 3 days before you handle your snake after any particular feeding. And for Bobby, I kind of, feed him a smaller rodent, and then when I do handle him, I handle him really gently and put him really gently around my neck. Make sure I don't really move him that much. And he is really puppy dog tame, so he doesn't mind being on my shoulder. He doesn't freak out and squirm around. He's usually just kind of sitting motionless. And so far, Bobby has never regurgitated, and it's been working pretty well. But I'd say pretty much in general, if you're feeding a ball python, I probably wouldn't handle for at least 2 days, preferably 3 days after feeding. And another kind of a thing that I've actually seen here in my collection as far as regurgitation, and when I first started out, I had a whole bunch of ball python hatchlings. And the way I was feeding my hatchlings at first is I'd have like 50 hatchlings, and I thought out like 50 mice, which is not really the good way to do it, because all your hatchlings aren't going to eat every single time. And when I first started out, I had all these extra mice from some of the hatchlings that wouldn't eat. So what I do is I take some of those mice and try to feed it to my hatchlings and kind of double up or triple up in some cases, feeding hatchlings like 3 meals in 1 day, pretty much back to back. And I found in most cases they can handle 2 mice pretty much back to back, but when you hit 3, it's pretty much the limitation. I've actually had a couple hatchlings regurgitate after 3 rodents in a row. So I think it really depends on pretty much the limitation of how much a hatchling can eat, or any snake as far as that matter. So you really don't want to feed them too many meals meals all in a row. And kind of what I do is, like when I'm feeding my reticulated python, if I'm using, for example, I actually have Lucy, who is a 100-pound reticulated python. She is really big, and I'm feeding her rats, which is really too small, you know, almost on the edge for a retic, but I like to use them up out of my rat breeding operation here. I have all these extra rats, so it's like free food for my retics. So instead of feeding her a whole bunch of rats all in a row on the same day, what I'll actually do is I'll feed 1 or 2 rats on one day, and then feed a couple more rats on the second day, a couple more rats on the third day. And what I found, if you actually do that approach, it's kind of interesting because a ball python or any snake, what they'll do is if you actually keep feeding them back to back on the same day, they really don't know how much, what the limitation is as far as how much they can eat. But if you spread it out over a few days, what actually happens is they sit there for like a day or so with all those rodents in their belly, and they kind of get bloated a little, and they're like, I can't eat one more rodent after all those rodents. I think the snake can kind of figure out when to stop if you kind of space it out over a couple days. So as a matter of fact, that's pretty much what I do with a lot of my hatchlings now. I'll feed them one day, and then I'll come back. If some of them are looking a little thin, instead of giving them a second rodent on the same day, what I'll do is I'll follow up the following day. And if they don't eat it, I have a bunch of other rodents that will actually take it too, so I don't waste any rodents, which is kind of the thing. If you have a lot of snakes and a lot of rodents, you kind of want to try to avoid wasting rodents at the same time. So that's another way I've actually seen snakes regurgitate. Another way is if you're feeding too big of a rodent, which I've actually, I don't know if I've ever had that happen in my collection, but I've actually seen it where people feed too big, you know. So for example, like for Bobby here, you know, pretty much the thickest part of the body is the maximum that you want to go. I've actually gone a little bit bigger than that, but I've seen people that go way above, you know, super large rat for ball python. Sometimes they'll try to eat it, and then it'll be too big, and then before they actually can even start digesting it, they'll regurgitate that because the rodent's too big. As a matter of fact, there's a couple times where I doubled up on some really big rodents on some of my female breeders, and it was kind of right on the edge. They looked super bloated right after I fed them, and I thought that it was probably a bad idea to feed them 2 big rodents back to back. And the interesting thing too is if you feed them too big of a rodent, or maybe too much all at once, even if they don't regurgitate, sometimes they'll actually go off of food. I think it's kind of an unpleasant experience for the snake, and they go, I don't want to eat again because the last time was kind of unpleasant. And that's another thing. I think it's a little bit better to actually feed them smaller rodents more often. Although I have seen, as a matter of fact, I actually watched a YouTube video, and they kind of had this competition between 2 snakes where they were feeding one snake smaller rodents, multiple smaller rodents, and they had another snake which was from the same clutch, the same exact size of snake. They were feeding it bigger rodents less frequently. So it was the same weight of rodents, several small ones versus one big one, kind of on a regular basis. And at the end of the study, I can't remember how long they were doing it, but the big one was like almost twice as big as the smaller snake, which was pretty incredible. So if you're actually feeding bigger rodents, I think your snakes actually grow faster, which is kind of an interesting anomaly. Not that you'd really want kind of push your snakes, you know. A lot of times I actually prefer to feed smaller rodents more often. I think it's a little bit easier on the snake. And another place I've actually seen regurgitation in ball pythons is if you actually have the hot spot too hot or too cold. I've seen some people, they'll have hot spots that are like maybe in the 70s, and I'd say that is too cold. 70 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll have to convert to Celsius if you're not from the United States. I'm actually here in Colorado in the United States, and we do everything in feet and in Fahrenheit. It's kind of crazy. So I've actually seen some people, you know, kind of, you know, thinking about their setups with their ball pythons, and I'd say as far as a hot spot, most people will recommend maybe 88 degrees for a hot spot. I like to set all my hot spots at about 90, and a lot of times I'll actually have a whole rack, and I'll actually put the probe right in the middle of the rack set at 90, so the tubs on the top and the bottom of the rack are a little bit cooler, maybe, you know, 80, 88, or a couple degrees cooler than that. I think you're all right. And I've actually seen people have really hot spots of like 95 or 96, statistics, and I kind of heard through the grapevine on one YouTube video that if you actually have your hot spot above, I think, like 95 or 96 degrees, something like that, you can temporarily sterilize your males, where if you're actually having problems breeding, it could be that your hot spot is too hot, and it can also cause regurgitation if your hot spot's too hot or if it's too cold. I thought that was kind of interesting. So the other place that I've actually seen regurgitation, and that is with my mouser ball pythons. I actually have some ball pythons that are only mice only. They'll only eat mice for whatever reason. And essentially you start out ball pythons on mice when they're hatchlings, and the older they get, you really want to transfer them over to rats eventually. They can actually get stuck on mice, which is kind of interesting. And if they get stuck on mice, you pretty much get to the point where I think I have 3 snakes that are really mousers that prefer mice over rats. And kind of the interesting thing is if I actually take those mousers and try to convert them over to rats, which I've done a few times, I actually have a jungle woman spider female that I'm slowly converting over to rats. And so far it looks like she's doing pretty good. She's taken a few rats here lately, but when I first converted her from mice, it seemed like the first couple rats that I fed her, she regurgitated the rats, which is kind of interesting. And I was actually trying to trick her. These rats, the rats were like almost the same size and the same color as a mouse. I was using white mice and I switched over to a white rat that was almost the same color, and I tried to scent it with a mouse, and for whatever reason when I fed her that rat, it seemed like she did not like it. It didn't digest very well, so she regurgitated it, which I thought was kind of odd as far as, you know, she could tell the difference as far as the digestion. But it seemed like after I got her over to the rats, she really hasn't regurgitated since the first, I'd say maybe since, you know, in the last few years that I've had her. When I first tried to transition her over, she regurgitated maybe twice, and then finally transitioned over to where she wouldn't regurgitate anymore, which is kind of crazy. And it kind of scares you when they regurgitate too, because you're worried about, you know, something wrong with your ball python. And kind of the interesting thing about, you know, mousers, and specifically, if you actually have a snake that regurgitates, probably what I would do is I would wait like at least 2 weeks to try to feed again, whether it's a mouse or not. And kind of the interesting thing is if you actually try to feed and they regurgitate, and then you wait 2 weeks and then they regurgitate again, probably what I would do is I would follow up the third time at 2-week intervals in between. I'd probably follow up with a mouse, because it seems like the mice are a lot more digestible and less likely to actually be regurgitated. So it's pretty complicated, you know, getting into the whole, you know, trying to figure out what's going on with my snake. I've actually heard in some cases your ball pythons can have some parasites, you know, internal parasites or some bad bacteria or something. I haven't really seen a lot of cases of that, although I have heard kind of rumors of people having that problem. I think it's extremely rare. That, you know, ball pythons are pretty much bulletproof. there's pretty much nothing that'll kill a ball python. If you actually do pick up something really weird and exotic like that, I think it would be kind of a fluke, and you definitely have to bring them to the vet. But I'd say if you have a ball python that continually regurgitates and gets thinner and thinner and you just can't figure it out, I would definitely bring it to a veterinarian. But I'd say in most cases, usually you can kind of take it easy and, you know, slowly feed them smaller and smaller rodents, maybe switch over to mice, and finally get them over that hump where they're not regurgitating anymore. And let me tell you, it can be pretty frustrating trying to figure out what's going on with your ball python. And probably one of the hardest things with snakes is, you know, between the respiratory infections, the mites, and the regurgitation, and the stubborn feeding, a lot of times those are probably the biggest things that you run into with ball pythons. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.